Welcome to you all, and to our program tonight, Varieties of Scientific Experience. Mary Baker Eddy, William James, and other investigators, honest investigators of the 19th century. In exploring our archival collections here, as well as our circulating and reference collections here at the Mary Baker Eddy Library, on this topic, it quickly becomes apparent just how important science was to the average 19th century American, to the 19th century American mind. In our collections upstairs, for example, in the research facility, which is open to the public and is in our fourth floor here in this building, we have a multitude of documents relating to the life and career of Mary Baker Eddy, to the history of the Christian Science Church. And in that collection, one discovers materials that really bring to life this subject that we are going to be discussing tonight. For example, in the scrapbooks of Mary Baker Eddy, one finds clippings from the period on all manner of subjects, clippings from the popular press of the day, but certainly very, very well represented are clippings, citations relating to the subjects of science. They can range from what we would consider now more fanciful subjects like phrenology, but also include many clippings on geology, chemistry, astronomy, and also long excerpts from important scientific treatises that were being written at the time, for example, from On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So it's a very rich period. Science was a source of great fascination to Americans. They crowded to lecture halls like this one, or the equivalent thereof in the 19th century, to hear the leading experts of the time discourse upon their specialties. But what's interesting is that, at least for a long while in the 19th century, these experts wouldn't necessarily have thought of themselves first and foremost as scientists. That expression, that idea, wouldn't come into vogue until much later in the century. More typically, they might have described themselves as naturalists or even natural theologians. But by 1910, the year of Mary Baker Eddy's death, the concept of science was well rooted, and we were well underway into what we now call the scientific age, the age in which we now all live. So a very important part of our conversation tonight will be in surveying that landscape of 19th century thought about science and how dramatically it changed from its outset until its finale and in the early years of the 20th century. At the outset of the 19th century, people who were engaged in scientific inquiry, scientific enterprises, weren't the credentialed professionals that we have today. There were no great research institutions like Johns Hopkins or our neighbors across the street. You wouldn't have found a postdoc in chemistry walking around the streets of Belmont or Cambridge. That kind of professionalism didn't exist in the sciences. So it was a terrain very open to the amateur, the honest investigator. And Mary Baker Eddy was one of those heroic amateurs, honest investigators. And an area of great importance to her, a subject that she chose to investigate, was homeopathy, a therapeutic treatment for mind and body, very popular in the 19th century and regaining in popularity today. And for her, it was an area in which she could test hypotheses, use her own scientific methodology about the relationship of mind and body. So another area that we will explore tonight will be homeopathy, how it related to the overall thrust of science in that time, and in particular, its connection to the life, work, and ideas of Mary Baker Eddy. Science, of course, was a central concept to Mary Baker Eddy. She leads with it in the title of her most famous and important work, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And in describing her system of ideas, she uses the term as Christian Science, in Christian Science. So for Mary Baker Eddy, the meaning, the import of the word science was of utmost significance. But it was also an area that was of utmost significance to thinkers in the realm of science in the 19th century. What did science really mean? And so, as another part of tonight's discussion, we're going to look at rival philosophies on the meaning of science, on what science was, and how those rival philosophies fared in this atmosphere of 19th century science in the United States. Finally, the meeting of science and culture was very, very fertile in the United States of this time. And it really touched into almost every sphere of life, certainly into many, many different professions. And as culture and science interacted, Americans responded to this new way of thinking. And we're looking for a new prism through which to think and analyze and assess. And so out of this query came a new philosophy, which is known today as the philosophy of pragmatism. And two of its leading exponents were William James and Charles Peirce. And so that will be another subject of tonight's conversation, about the ideas of James and Peirce, and interestingly also about how William James intersected with Mary Baker Eddy as part of his journey, as part of his work and his defense of his ideas and their importance in American culture at large. So I know it's quite a bit of fare. I hope it comes across more as a menu of tapas, of delights of different flavors of the period for you to taste than anything else. And we'll get started now with a quick introduction of our panel. Jon Roberts, immediately to my right, is Tomorrow Foundation Professor of History at Boston University. And he will be taking us back to the 19th century and giving us a survey of how, an overview of science and its meaning in 19th century America. To Jon's right is Anne Kirschman. She's a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, and she will be talking this evening about homeopathy in 19th century America and how it related to the overall thrust of science in that time. To Anne's right, immediate right, is David Nartonis. He's a writer and scholar in the philosophy of science, and he will be discussing two rival philosophies of science in the 19th century and how they respectively fared during that period. To David's right is another David Pfeiffer, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Indiana in Indianapolis. And David will be talking about pragmatism, its history in 19th century America. And then finally, furthest down on the table is my colleague from the Mary Baker Eddy Library, our senior research archivist, Judy Hunnicky, and she will be letting us in on some of what one can learn about this subject through our collections here at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. So Jon, why don't you lead the way?
Be happy to. It is a great pleasure to be here. I was telling a couple of the panelists before we started that I never fail to be in awe of the adults in the Boston area. Here we are at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening talking about something that could be perceived, I guess, to be somewhat esoteric, science in the 19th century. Now, I know why we're here, but you're here. And that's, I think, really impressive to most of us. And it's a real tribute to the intellectual interest that Bostonians have that a panel like this can attract this kind of crowd. I'm going to be working from a somewhat prepared text, and I apologize for that in advance. But I do have a rationale. I'm a college professor. And as a college professor, when you wind me up, I go for 50 minutes. You don't want me to go for 50 minutes. So I prepared something to make sure that I'm under at least 50 minutes. I will make you that promise. As Jonathan indicated in his introduction, I've been charged with the task of providing an overview of the development of 19th century science and its place in American cultural and intellectual life. Now, let me assure you that in the brief time that I have this evening, I can't possibly do justice to this topic. I do hope, though, that by broaching some of the major issues relating to the history of American ideas, concerning the appropriate scope of science, the major conceptual developments that were associated with the sciences in the 19th century, and last but certainly not least, the nature of scientific method as scientists themselves conceived of it, I can provide us with some useful context, a contextual background, as it were, for the discussion of some of the more specific topics that will follow. All right, let me begin by noting that among the most conspicuous changes that occurred within American culture in the 19th century were an increasing use of the term science within the public arena and the emergence of a sometimes rather heated controversy concerning what should be included within the purview of that term. Prior to the 1830s, the term science typically retained the meaning that it had acquired back in the medieval period. That is to say, science was characteristically used as a synonym for accurate, systematic knowledge of all kinds. In this context, for example, theology was often referred to as the queen of the sciences. We obviously don't think of it as a science today, but at the time was viewed as the queen of the sciences. The terms that were most frequently used to describe what we think of when we think of science today was not science, but natural history, and even more frequently, natural philosophy. In addition, practitioners of natural history and natural philosophy were, when they were referred to as people of science at all, were typically referred to as men of science. There were some women who did science, but the common phrase was men of science. In fact, the term scientist wasn't even coined until 1834. Well, accompanying these terminological changes, the emergence of the term science was a good deal of controversy concerning the fields of inquiry that deserve to be called sciences. During the course of the 19th century, Americans typically held that science involved systematic knowledge, knowledge arrived at through a critical evaluation of empirical evidence, but they increasingly limited the scope of science to those disciplines that engaged in the study of material entities and physical processes. As it happened, and as you can probably imagine, many Americans deplored this tendency to narrow the meaning of science in that fashion. In 1867, for example, an eminent American philologist by the name of William Dwight Whitney denounced what he called, and I'm quoting Whitney here, a growing disposition to restrict the honorable title of science to those departments of knowledge which are founded on the unvarying laws of material nature. A few years later, the theologically conservative Princeton theologian Charles Hodge similarly complained that the term science was commonly seen as, in Hodge's words, restricted to the knowledge of a particular class of facts and of their relations, namely the facts of nature or of the external world. For his part, Hodge, even in the 1870s, was intent on describing theology as a science on the grounds that it took on the task of arranging biblical data in a systematic manner. It's in this context of controversy concerning the appropriate meaning of the term science, I think, that we can place the claim of Mary Baker Eddy and a number of other proponents of mental healing that their positions rightly deserve to be considered as science. Eddy endorsed a more or less classical view of the meaning of science and held that science, rightly conceived, simply referred to genuine knowledge and pure truth. And from that perspective, she concluded that the term science should be applied to what she called, and I'm quoting Mary Baker Eddy here, the laws of God and his government of the universe, inclusive of man. In addition, Mary Baker Eddy insisted that her views qualified as science because the truth of the claims that she was making could be established through an appeal to empirical evidence, the empirical evidence of people's bodies that had been healed through her methods. And so she said, why shouldn't we call this science as well? It is, after all, based on empirical evidence. Well, during the 19th century, discussions of the appropriate meaning of science were accompanied by important changes in the norms of scientific explanation and discourse within the realms of the natural sciences themselves. To explain what I mean by this, I should probably begin by noting that prior to about 1750, discussion of the natural world had been inextricably bound up with discourse about God. Rarely was the natural world discussed by natural philosophers or natural historians without, in one way or another, invoking the Creator. To be sure, even in the so-called early modern period, natural historians and natural philosophers did manage to describe some natural phenomena in terms of so-called secondary agencies and natural laws. And yet, during that period, few of those practitioners of science expressed any qualms at all at invoking the supernatural whenever they were unable to account for natural phenomena in terms of natural processes. Now, in truth, even after 1750, scientists continued on occasion to ascribe events that occurred within the natural world to the agency of God. Let me cite just one very notable example. In 1859, Charles Darwin could write of what he called, and I'm quoting Darwin here, laws impressed on matter by the Creator, Creator with a capital C, without seeming to violate recognizable canons of scientific discourse. With that said, though, it's still the case that during the period after 1750, scientists in one field after another began to make ever more concerted efforts to establish a new principle. The principle that, as one natural historian put it, it is the aim of science to narrow the domain of the supernatural by bringing all phenomena within the scope of natural laws and secondary causes. Now, it's important to understand, I think, that the majority of scientists, the majority of natural scientists in the 19th century, did not regard this commitment to restrict their discourse to naturalistic agencies as in any respect a denial of the existence of God. Most natural scientists in the 19th century were fervent believers. So what's at issue here is not belief in the existence of God. Instead, scientists simply regarded their decision to restrict discourse to naturalistic methods as a methodological principle for the practice of science. It's certainly the case, though, that by the late 19th century, virtually all members of the scientific community, a community, by the way, that experienced rapid growth and increasing professionalization as the century wore on, most natural scientists had come to accept the principle that we commonly refer to today as methodological naturalism as the norm of scientific discourse. We will assume that it's possible to explain all natural events using natural agencies. In effect, natural scientists then were embracing a subtly different idea of what counted as a scientific explanation than the ideas that they had previously held. The vast majority of them came to believe that even in cases where they were unable to account for natural phenomena in terms of natural agencies and natural processes, the appropriate response was not to invoke the supernatural as the explanation. It was rather to solicit further scientific inquiry. Not to put too fine a point on it, natural scientists in the late 19th century professed ignorance rather than ascribed events to the supernatural. Well, one of the factors that undoubtedly facilitated the establishment of naturalism as the methodological norm of scientific discourse and explanation was the success that natural scientists had in describing much of the structure and the behavior of the universe in terms of three general concepts. The first of these concepts was the atomic theory of matter. This theory, which was most closely associated with the work of the British natural philosopher John Dalton during the first decade of the 19th century, postulated that all matter consisted of atoms, that those atoms can be neither created nor destroyed, that all atoms of the same chemical element are essentially identical, that different elements have different kinds of atoms, and that chemical reactions take place by means of a rearrangement of atoms. In effect, the Daltonian view of atoms, or the atomic theory of matter, encouraged scientists to put forward an image of matter that most people could easily visualize. An image of matter as a set of small, round, solid, indestructible particles that operated in accordance with mechanical principles. You probably are all now remembering your general science days in ninth grade. That's sort of the way atoms were pictured. Well, a second concept that was particularly central in 19th century scientific thought was the theory of the conservation of energy. That theory, which was developed during the 1840s by really a number of different physicists at roughly the same time, asserted that energy could be neither created nor destroyed. Finally, a third concept that played a central role in the scientific worldview of the 19th century was the concept of evolution. This concept was associated in the realm of celestial mechanics with the nebular hypothesis, a theory that talked about the origin of the solar system, and in the realm of biology, of course, the idea of evolution was associated with the idea of the transmutation of species. Using these three concepts in tandem, the atomic theory of matter, the theory of the conservation of energy, and evolution, scientists in 19th century America increasingly came to regard the universe as an evolving, excuse me, but essentially closed system of matter and energy, a system that could be entirely described in terms of a series of chains of cause and effect. So you have the universe, this picture of the universe as a kind of evolving machine. Well, the final issue that I'd like to discuss in attempting to provide some context for this evening's discussion is the issue of scientific method. Now, probably the most important thing to be said about scientific method is that historians have discovered that for all of the rhetoric that scientists devoted to the topic of scientific method in the 19th century, no clear, consistent picture emerges as to what they really meant by that term. Every scientist talked about scientific method. It's not at all clear what they actually meant by that term. Scientific method appears to have functioned in the 19th century as a kind of catch-all term for a whole multitude of widely disparate practices. Some scientists, emphasizing the importance of carefully observing and recording natural phenomena, implied that science was an essentially passive, contemplative endeavor, an endeavor that required humility, modesty, even meekness. Others, and probably here we're talking about the majority of scientists, emphasized the aggressive, the dynamic, the experimental aspects of scientific investigation. Probably the best generalization we can make is that this period witnessed a transition from a virtually universal commitment on the part of scientists to what was called Baconianism, to a willingness on the part of scientists to accept, in at least some cases, what came to be known as the hypothetico-deductive method. By Baconianism, scientists were really referring to a couple of interlinked ideas. The first is a commitment to empiricism. Empiricism in the sense that proponents of Baconianism affirmed that knowledge about the natural world must rest on a careful, exhaustive collection of facts, and then the construction of cautious, judicious generalizations that are based on those facts. That's the first idea of Baconianism. The second idea that's characteristically associated with Baconianism is that it's unacceptable to make claims about nature that are based on speculation, conjecture, or, to use a term that was particularly pejorative in the 19th century, mere hypothesis. Scientists made a very important distinction in the 19th century between theory and hypothesis. Theory, good thing, based on facts. Hypothesis, speculative, conjecture, unacceptable. Now, for about the first 2/3 of the 19th century, scientists frequently proclaimed their enthusiastic commitment to Baconianism, although I think it's fair to say that they weren't always consistent in adhering to the precepts of Baconianism in practice. But then in the last third of the 19th century, scientists in a growing number of fields began to practice what's often referred to as the hypothetico-deductive method. This was a method of arriving at scientific theories that involved introducing an explanatory hypothesis and then predicting the consequences that would ensue or the inferences that could legitimately be made if that hypothesis were actually true. If subsequent observations show that the predicted consequences do in fact ensue, and that the predicted inferences can in fact legitimately be made, this was thought to serve as grounds for believing that a theory is probably true. Well, that then is my quick and dirty overview of science in the 19th century. At this point, I'll happily turn the program over to the other panelists who will tell us how some of these ideas were put into actual practice in American culture.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much, John. We're all going to take a breath and get ready for the next segment. Yes. So,
well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jonathan and Leslie and the Mary Baker Eddy Library for organizing this wonderful program, and thank you for including me. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk about homeopathy, which was one of several medical alternatives to emerge in the 19th century in opposition to the debilitating therapeutics of regular physicians, which included bloodletting, complex drug cocktails, violent purgatives, and lead and mercury-based medicines. But by the middle of the century, it was clear that the aim of homeopathy was not merely to provide an alternative to the established medical order, but to overturn it and replace it. Founded by German physician Samuel Hahnemann, homeopathy gained converts among established physicians and the general public, not only for its role in the reform of medicine, but for its links to social reform more broadly, such as abolitionism and race equality, and especially women's rights. Homeopathy also encompassed an opposition to religious as well as medical orthodoxy during a time when dissenters from established institutions fueled both medical and religious sectarianism. Martial and religious metaphors are pervasive in the rhetoric of homeopaths, who described homeopathy as a battle fought between the Goliath of the old medicine and the young David of the new. A considerable number of homeopaths, including early leaders such as Hans Birch-Gram and Constantine Hering, were Swedenborgian, and new church members were among homeopathy's strongest supporters. Homeopathy was taken up in diverse ways by many other healers, including mesmerists and New Thought advocates. It was popular among New England transcendentalists and with health seekers such as Mary Baker Eddy, who experimented with various methods of healing in her quest for emotional, physical, and spiritual health. Homeopathy was both a populist movement, which provided a role for lay practitioners, as well as a learned profession, whose trained practitioners viewed themselves equal in all respects to regular physicians. Homeopaths developed an institutional structure similar to that of regular medicine, with medical schools, dispensaries, hospitals, and medical societies. However, homeopathy's rapid growth and popularity was largely driven by its acceptance among women. One of the most effective tools in the propagation of homeopathy had been the domestic medical kit, including a home health manual and vials of ready-to-use remedies. The box and book were designed primarily to aid mothers in the treatment of uncomplicated and common illnesses within their families, but they were often a route to a medical career for women interested in becoming physicians. Others became lay healers in their communities, as did Mary Baker Eddy, who used Yar's new manual of homeopathic practice throughout the 1950s to prescribe remedies for herself, her friends, and acquaintances. The principles of homeopathic science express a divinely created, rational, and orderly universe. They include several important elements. One, that a group of morbid symptoms, from whatever the cause, will be removed by a single medicinal substance or remedy, which is capable of producing a similar set of symptoms in a healthy person. Hahnemann did not claim discovery of the law of similars, but he believed his drug experiments confirmed it. Second, that a spiritual vital force or dynamis animates the material body and retains all the parts of the organism in admirable, harmonious, vital operation. And third, that the curative property of homeopathic medicines is enhanced or potentized by a process of dilution and succussion, which is a special kind of shaking, enabling extremely minute doses to effect a cure. And that the non-material vital force often required a subtle remedy without even a trace of the material drug present. According to Hahnemann, derangement of the vital force from some unknown cause results in the appearance of morbid symptoms which comprise the disease. Given the correct homeopathic remedy, a similar artificial disease produced by the drug would substitute itself for the natural or original disease and cause it to disappear, allowing the vital force to return to this normal state of balance. Homeopaths viewed the work of testing of drugs, called provings, and the continued expansion of their materia medica, the cornerstone of homeopathic science. Provings were the work of physicians, those who were trained to be careful observers and listeners, people who would be able to distinguish fact from fiction in patients' narratives of illness. And patients themselves were involved in the science of therapeutics, in their awareness and articulation of their experience of illness. To many people, homeopathy appeared more scientific than regular medicine for its precise methods of observation and exactness in accumulating data in the testing of drugs, for their insistence on the purity of drugs, and the testing of harmless doses on healthy persons instead of animals or people who were ill. In the 1870s, homeopaths at Boston University were among the first to institute the use of control groups and placebos in drug testing. Homeopathic science also provided an important rationale for the full inclusion of women in the profession. When leaders of the American Institute of Homeopathy, which is the equivalent of the AMA, discussed women's admission to that organization in 1869, they noted the need for more and better testing of drugs for women's diseases. The president of the organization, Carol Dunham, warned that women physicians would be unlikely to take up that work of provings unless they were recognized as full and equal workers in every respect. Another argued the folly of only involving one-half the brains of the race in improving the indispensable science of homeopathy. Science, he said, should accept help from every quarter. By the middle of the 19th century, many patients, as well as women and men entering the medical profession, considered homeopathic medicine a respectable and scientific alternative to regular medicine. The decades of the 1870s and 80s are considered the heyday for homeopathy in terms of its success. However, the rise of German laboratory medicine during that same period led to a new understanding of science based not on dogma or speculation, not on concepts of orthodoxy or anti-orthodoxy, but on a universalist science based on the results of laboratory research. By 1900, homeopathic medical colleges were struggling to keep pace with the new scientific and educational requirements of modern medicine. Longer courses of study, full-time faculties, additions of new subjects to the curricula, and the addition of well-equipped laboratories, mandatory clinical instruction, and clerkships in teaching hospitals. Within the homeopathic profession, physicians had to confront the issue of identity. What exactly did it mean to be a homeopathic physician in light of these developments? Most agreed that there was no special homeopathic understanding of pathology or physiology or chemistry. They argued that homeopathy was really a therapeutic specialty within modern medicine. However, a minority of traditionalists resisted the assimilation of homeopathy into organized medicine and held fast to Hahnemann's teachings, including those who became students of James Tyler Kent. Kent was the guiding light of purists who rejected laboratory-based experiential knowledge and a science of medicine which lacked fixed principles according to natural laws. Kent believed that the only science of medicine was a knowledge of how to cure the sick. Quote, "The scientific physician, when asked what he knows, must say, 'I know how to cure the sick.' If he really knows this, he has the knowledge and is scientific. If he has not this knowledge, he is a pretender and a fraud." For Kent, there would be no greater laboratory than that of clinical observation and experience, with the knowledge that everything seen and unseen, material and immaterial, proceeds in order and harmony, linked together by a vital force, which proceeds from God. Kent emphasized the importance of mental symptoms in determining the correct remedy, as they would act first upon man's will and understanding, and ultimately upon the tissues and the functions of the body. It appears that Mary Baker Eddy was familiar with Kent's teachings. Homeopathy, she said, quote, "enlists faith in the pharmacy of the human mind, whereas Christian Science exterminates the drug and rests on the divine mind alone." But while Eddy acknowledged the correspondence between homeopathy and Christian Science, homeopaths attempting to conform to the new ideals of scientific medicine were anxious to distance themselves from practitioners of what they called the drugless cults of osteopathy and chiropractic and Christian Science. At a meeting in 1901 of the American Institute of Homeopathy, members discussed the need for vigorous action by the Institute against the doctrines of Mrs. Eddy, who had recently characterized homeopathy as a stepping stone from allopathy to Eddyism. Mary Bell Brown, Dean of the Homeopathic New York Medical College and Hospital for Women, denied an accusation that Christian Science was spreading among women who believed in homeopathy. But spreading it undoubtedly was. As the 19th century alternatives to orthodox medicine waned, Christian Science, along with osteopathy, naturopathy, and chiropractic, welcomed women into the healing professions at a time when opportunities in both homeopathic and mainstream medicine became increasingly scarce.
Well, thank you very much, Anne.
You're welcome.
Well, again, time for a deep breath as then we move on to David Nartonis and just let you get into the subject of philosophy of science.
Thank you, Jonathan. I don't think you'll get a better overview of the science and religion situation in the 19th century than Jon Roberts has given us just a few minutes ago. What I would like to add to that or to point out is that if you try to put the Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz into that 19th century picture, you start to find that there are complications and there is something else going on. When Agassiz arrived at Harvard from Europe in 1846, he was welcomed with tremendous enthusiasm. And that's a very odd thing, because what was going on officially at Harvard was just what John has described. That is, recently Harvard had adopted a textbook by Dugald Stewart, a Scottish professor and a Calvinist, which is really the transition between the Baconian idea of science, that science is just a kind of meditative observation, and the later idea that it's making educated guesses or hypotheses and testing them. So that was official. But here's Louis Agassiz arriving on campus and describing science in a totally different way and being wildly applauded for it. What is going on? Well, I believe that what is going on is that there are two great traditions of science and theology, or philosophy of science and theology, and that they were still fighting it out in the 19th century. Although by the time you get to the 20th century, one of them had won and the other one had pretty much disappeared. And that Louis Agassiz belongs to the tradition that disappeared, or pretty much disappeared. I'd like to call it the Hellenistic tradition. In this tradition, one assumes that the creator of the universe is a benevolent, intelligent being with a plan for the creation. And in that tradition, science, or what we would call today science, is an understanding of the creator's intelligent plan. Now, this particular view, this particular tradition, goes way, way back to the Greeks, and it goes back to the early Christian writers. But among Christians, it always had a difficult problem that it was never, I don't think, able to completely solve. And that is, if the world is created by a benevolent, intelligent creator, where did evil come from? Some of the earliest Christian writers played with the pagan idea of two creators, one that created an evil world, the evil in the world, and the other that was benevolent. But that didn't fit the scriptures. In the Middle Ages, you had an idea that's usually ascribed to St. Augustine, that evil came into the world through man, that when Adam disobeyed, that's when evil came into the world. But that has problems too, because if you've got a benevolent, intelligent creator, why did that creator let man disobey? So by the end of the Middle Ages, you start to have a new tradition arising among Christians, among Western people. And that is what I'd like to call the European tradition. The European tradition says that instead of the creator being benevolent and intelligent, he is simply powerful and can do anything that the creator wants to do. Now, there you don't have any problem of evil in that tradition, because anything God does is good, whether it looks evil or good to us. And in fact, in the 18th century, some Calvinists would have even thanked God for condemning them to an eternity of suffering for their sins, because anything God does is good. So you thank God for it. Now, in that change from the Hellenistic view of a benevolent creator to the European view of a powerful creator has tremendous implications for your ideas of science. Because if there's no plan, if the creator can't be constrained by a plan, then science can't be the understanding of the Creator's plan. There is no plan. So science then has to become observing nature to see what God is doing in his power. And later, this becomes making hypotheses about what nature will do in the future and testing them and so on. Now, when you get to Louis Agassiz arriving at Harvard, he actually was in his lectures, he was preaching the older Hellenistic idea. And this was really a breakthrough for a lot of people in New England, because they were not very happy with the European idea of an all-powerful creator. And they wanted to go back, at least partway, to the idea of a benevolent creator. And here's Louis Agassiz saying that there is a plan of nature, that it's due to the creator, and that we can find it, we can look at codfish, we can see what the creator's idea of a cod is, and so on. Well, this particular resurgence had leaders like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, people we call the Transcendentalists. It was really a revolt against the European idea of science and religion. And when Agassiz arrived, he was kind of the final piece of the puzzle, because he was this famous naturalist from Europe. He was very important to Mary Baker Eddy, and she mentions him in her writings a number of times. And I believe he was important to her because he represented this Hellenistic idea of a benevolent, intelligent creator. As you probably know, Agassiz's particular popularity didn't last very long. 13 years after he arrived, Darwin published The Origin of Species, which was almost a prime example of hypothetico-deductive science that Jon described. And Agassiz's ideas faded. Some of you may have heard, let's go forward to the 20th century and the 21st century. Some of you may have heard people say that Christian Science is neither scientific nor Christian. Well, if they're working out of this European tradition, they're right. Because according to that idea of a powerful, capricious creator, and science which is purely gathering data through the physical senses, Christian Science doesn't match up. But I would argue that Christian Science does fit squarely in the Hellenistic tradition, and that that's the tradition in which Mary Baker Eddy was working.
Thank you. Well, that was terrific. Thank you very much, David. And David Pfeiffer.
Sure. Delighted to be here this evening. Academics like myself cherish every opportunity to talk about those things we read about and think about and research for years on end, and it's a real privilege to be here. And I'm picking up a different strand or theme of what was going on in the 19th century, dealing with many of the same events and topics and concepts, but in a slightly different way. William James, 1842-1910, and Charles Peirce, 1839-1914, were well-known scientists and philosophers of the 19th century. They brought to the world pragmatism, the United States' one and only contribution to the history of philosophic systems. Pragmatism is an outgrowth of the developments within science, especially as manifest in the works of Charles Darwin. The evolution debate forced everyone to consider anew what counted as science and scientific method. Scientists doing more laboratory work, stressing procedures and processes over observation, and seeking for future confirmations of present ideas all came to the fore. In simple terms, pragmatism brings the scientific method to bear on philosophic issues. The chief virtue of pragmatism is that it proposes a method whereby concepts and ideas can be tested within experience. Concepts and ideas must have consequences, some resulting action in lived experience, or are meaningless. James showed this testing worked in psychology, Peirce in physics, evolution theory, history, sign theory, and metaphysics. Both James and Peirce showed clearly that religious ideas can be connected with lived experience in a most meaningful manner. Their views of science. William James graduated from Harvard College and went on to earn a Harvard MD degree. He taught physiology, psychology, and eventually philosophy at Harvard. He established the first clinical laboratory for studying psychology, and his 2-volume work, The Principles of Psychology, 1890, was a foundation for this new scientific discipline. The Principles of Psychology is filled with reports of experiments and data. The work is truly scientific in the most modern sense. Throughout his career, James was always interested in new developments that might shed light on how the human mind worked and in what constituted human experience. He accepted the new scientific methods in very general terms, but was more interested in exploring all types of experiences. He personally sought diverse experiments and experiences. His studies included psychic phenomena, the paranormal, and the use of mind-altering drugs, always with an eye to seeing where the experiences might lead. He attended untold numbers of seances, finding them frauds, but one medium, Leonora Piper, he could not prove conclusively a fraud. He kept going back, trying to figure out what was transpiring. In his grand book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, James recognizes 8 kinds of religious experiences. James himself had a religious or mystical experience. Being open to all possible human experiences and having a very broad sense of what was an acceptable experiment is what characterizes James's view of science. If you wish, James thinks of science as an attitude, a very open-minded, inclusive way of viewing experience. He never wished to close off any possible avenue for truth or meaning. James's philosophical colleague and friend, Charles Peirce, also graduated from Harvard College and went on to earn a Harvard master's degree and one of the first Bachelor of Science degrees in chemistry from Harvard's newly formed Lawrence Scientific School. While James has been labeled a life scientist, Peirce was a hard scientist, a physicist, astronomer, mathematician, and logician. He was the first to determine the force of gravity of the Earth, first to determine that our solar system, the Milky Way, is more or less donut-shaped, the first to propose that the length of the meter should be standardized using the wavelength of light, the first to propose electronic computers, even though they were not even possible during his lifetime, a founder of the modern discipline of semiotic sign theory, and a major contributor to logic and mathematics. While Peirce agreed with James on the scientific attitude, Peirce thought of science more as a methodology for resolving questions and problems that arise within experience. Peirce saw 3 major steps in the scientific method, which are also at the core of pragmatism. 1, develop hypotheses which might answer or resolve the question at hand. 2, derive consequences from these hypotheses which can be tested in future experience. And 3, do the testing, the experiments. Peirce felt that the generation of hypotheses is the hardest part and the most important part of the scientific endeavor. 2 hypotheses Peirce explored are that evolution is testable given a great length of time, and that the reality of God can be proven. Their views on religion. James grew up in a family where religious discussions were the common dinner table fare. His father, Henry James the Elder, was on a lifelong spiritual quest, becoming a well-known writer on Swedenborgian topics. William James developed sensitivity to religious experiences and topics. His book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, is a tremendous catalog of diverse religious experiences, beliefs, and concepts. He was attempting to grasp the vastness of what humans call the religious. James twice, in 1894 and 1898, publicly defended Christian Science, putting his substantial reputation on the line against the advice of his friends and colleagues, because he felt that Christian Science was a religious experiment that should be allowed to proceed to see what results. To paraphrase something both James and Peirce said, "Do not block the road of inquiry." James several times went to a Christian Science practitioner for treatment for his heart disease. His most common note on the experience was, "Great mental lift, symptoms unchanged." James, in his own life, illustrated his view of science as it applies within religion. That is, turn to lived experience more than analytic thought. Be open-minded. Do not block inquiries. Be open to finding truth and meaning in unlikely places. Peirce was brought up in a family of Unitarians, the 19th century version. In many ways, his family was rather traditional, seeing the hand of God at work in the universe. Peirce's first wife was Episcopalian. He joined the church and in a general vague way throughout his life accepted the theology. In conjunction with communion at an Episcopal church, Peirce had his own religious or mystical experience. Even though Peirce had a mystical experience, in his later years, he worked hard at a scientific argument for the reality of God. This argument is built on the 3 steps within the scientific method. I cannot reiterate here this very long, complex argument, but what develops is that Peirce concludes that God is the fundamental principle of the universe, and Peirce proposed actual, testable consequences. The point is not to explore Peirce's concept of God, but to show that a hard scientist saw that the reality of God could be established on a firm scientific footing. 2 points should be carried away from these remarks. 1, science, as it was developing in the 19th century, was becoming more open on where truth could be found and what could count as truth. And 2, modern scientific methods were being applied to religion without diminishing either. Today, with regard to James's and Peirce's views of science, the openness they both sought is not as prevalent as they would desire, while the scientific method Peirce espoused is very much in evidence. With regard to James's and Peirce's views on religion, the views of James are read and considered, but not taken as seriously as when they were first written. The religious views of Peirce are virtually unknown. However, noteworthy for our purposes is the fact that a sympathetic application of scientific methods to religious experience was present in the 19th century. How might James's and Peirce's work relate to the endeavors of Mary Baker Eddy? Mrs. Eddy exemplifies the ideals of William James. She was open-minded, followed her insights wherever they might lead her, never put forth her own preconceived notions to change the path of inquiry or block the road of inquiry. Like James, Mrs. Eddy was a risk-taker, and she found religious significance in her immediate lived experience. Like Peirce, Mrs. Eddy used the pragmatic method to test her ideas. She said, in effect, if my concept of God is correct, the application of this concept will lead to actual consequences, changes in lived experience. If you wish, every time an individual has a Christian Science healing, that is experiential proof of the truth of Mrs. Eddy's concept of God. Thus, what Mary Baker Eddy was doing, independent of William James and Charles Peirce, was very much in harmony with their endeavors. All 3 were honest scientific investigators of the 19th century.
Well, thank you very much, David. And Judy, you can pick up the baton and
I'll see what I
bring
can
us to
do
the
here.
finish line.
I'm so grateful for everyone speaking tonight. I've learned so much as I was thinking about my assignment tonight, placing the library collections within the context of the sciences and scientific methods of Mary Baker Eddy's era. I remembered a piece that she wrote in the early years of the 20th century. It's titled Fundamental Christian Science, and it was originally written for a book titled Bohemia that's actually in a bookcase right outside my office. Bohemia was not a book on Christian Science or on the sciences, but I guess it might be called a kind of fundraiser. It was published to benefit a home for retired journalists, and American journalists, politicians, and some religious figures were asked to contribute essays. I'm sure Mary Baker Eddy was very conscious of the context for her remarks, and so Fundamental Christian Science is very much focused on explaining the influence of scientific thinkers and methodology on her own explorations of the nature of being. For example, she speaks of her discovery of Christian Science in 1866, but comments that here, however, was no stopping place, since science demanded a rational proof that the divine mind heals the sick and saves the sinner. God unfolded the way, the demonstration thereof was made, and the certainty of its value to the race firmly established. Yet, she also makes it quite clear that she sees her science as profoundly different from that of other thinkers. Kant, Locke, Berkeley, Tyndall, and Spencer afford little aid in understanding divine metaphysics or its therapeutics. Christian Science is a divine largesse, a gift of God, understood by and divinely natural to him who sits at the feet of Jesus, clothed in truth. Well, needless to say, there are many other documents in the library relating to Mary Baker Eddy that can deepen one's understanding of her ideas and her views on science and metaphysics. Her personal papers are here, and they include a large collection of letters and essays. There is also a collection of reminiscences written by those who knew her. Now, as Jonathan kind of mentioned at the beginning, another collection of interest to anyone who wants to explore the intellectual and cultural influences of the late 19th century is our large collection of newspaper clippings and scrapbooks. Now, let me explain, although perhaps Jonathan gave you a hint about this. What I've found fascinating in the clippings is that one can gain a sense of how the sciences and scientific discoveries were viewed by the media and by the general population. And as you can guess, sometimes perceptions varied wildly. Some of the titles that I saw in Mary Baker Eddy's own scrapbooks include, "Are the days of Darwinism numbered?" "Electricity, the gift of this century to the world." A definition of religious health, and an interesting essay by Lyman Abbott on the nature of thought, titled "The Temple, the Imagination." Investigating the media output of a century ago is a great way of putting oneself back into the ponderings and interests of another time. So, all of us at the library look forward to helping you with your own investigations. So please feel free to contact us. Some information on how to do this is on the back of your program. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of honest investigators and honest investigation, we'd love to hear from you. So any question is worth asking. It's been quite a presentation, and thank you to all of you. So, true to my counsel, I ask you to take another deep breath, and then we'd be happy to hear your questions. There are 2 people with microphones, so if you just raise your hand, somebody will come to you with a microphone.
Thank you. My question is directed primarily at David Pfeiffer, although I'd be happy to hear what anyone has to say. And it's maybe too simplistic, Dr. Pfeiffer, but could you compare and contrast pragmatism with a capital P, which is an American contribution to philosophy, and pragmatism as an ordinary word that we use? Is the lesser one just a generalization, kind of a fuzzy expression, or is there something else?
That is a confusion in language that grew up in the 20th century. When we talk about being pragmatic, we usually mean being very practical and doing those things that work. There is that strain in the writings of William James. Charles Sanders Peirce didn't particularly like the way James was going, so he changed his to pragmaticism, and he said, that's a name ugly enough that no one will use it. And he's right. But Charles Sanders Peirce was saying that the meaning of any concept will be the consequences that happen in experience. So that, what is the meaning of the word hard relative to a diamond? Well, it'll scratch glass, it'll scratch a lot of other kind of surfaces. So pragmatism is saying that the meanings of words and ideas is forward-looking, not backward-looking. And so there is a big difference between the two.
Would you say that Christian Science is a pragmatic
tool? Well, what I said in my remarks is that Mrs. Eddy is using the pragmatic theory of truth. There's a lot of theories of truth, but in her writing, she's got the traditional view of systematic truth, but then she also has the pragmatic view where she's saying, my concepts, when correctly held, bring a change in the future, in your future experience. And that's exactly what's going on in modern science, where people are coming up with hypotheses. They then try and figure out how this connects with nature, with the universe, with experience, and then they figure out ways to put those ideas to a test. And it's always saying truth is found in the future, not in the past.
Interested in any of you that might have an insight on analyzing the definitions of science. You talked about different definitions and controversy in the 19th century. How is that happening today, and what insight from your study of 19th century do you see enlightening the discussion today of what science is?
Well, I'd be willing to take a crack at this. Probably the most interesting and controversial debate that's going on now about the definition of science is the debate between proponents of intelligent design and evolutionists. Well, I say evolutionists, scientists in general, I guess. Proponents of intelligent design say, in effect, that the principle of methodological naturalism that I described, the determination to treat all natural phenomena as if they have natural causes and natural agencies, is a kind of arbitrary step. And proponents of intelligent design say you've ipso facto ruled out one of the possible explanations for natural events, to wit, God. Or they are a little bit disingenuous sometimes and say, we're not saying it's necessarily God, we are saying it's an intelligent designer. Scientists, by contrast, say, look, the norms of scientific discourse and explanation are, by their very nature, arbitrary. It would be just as arbitrary if we included God as a possible explanation. It's a little like questioning why a football field is 100 yards long. There's no rational explanation for that. That's the norm of playing football. And if you're going to play football, you play on a field that's 100 yards long. In like manner, scientists say, we realize that we may not have the entire truth about nature. But as a research agenda, it has been more fruitful to confess ignorance about things that we can't explain naturalistically than constantly appeal to the supernatural anytime we get up against a hard place. And so we plan. We play the game, we get to set the rules, and we plan to continue using methodological naturalism as our methodological norm, but this doesn't rule out other potential levels of explanation for natural events.
I was interested in the Hellenistic tradition and how it had embraced at least the possibility of the Christian Science as being one of the legitimate methods of inquiry. I just wonder, where did that go and where is that today? Are there still versions of it flourishing today, or has it kind of gone totally away?
Right. Well, I think that within the scientific community, you don't find much of that, although there have been a few writers who have said that some of Einstein's work was based more on intuition than observation, and that would be kind of a reintroduction of a bit of that. If there is this idea that truth comes from revelation, if it's around today, I would say it would tend to be more in religious circles than in scientific circles.
Can I just add a little comment to that? One of the things that I see going on is that the scientists aren't comfortable with the word intuition or revelation, but they're very comfortable with hypothesis. And to generate various alternative options is something that I think scientists are very, very comfortable with, but that puts it into a far more what I would call human realm than a religious realm.
Thank you. You've given us much to think about. In your thinking of this period, did the word mind come up, or was Mrs. Eddy the first one to use that? I learned it in philosophy as the fact that you know something and I know something. We both can say we know the same thing because there's a ground of being. Without that, there's no intelligence, there's no communication. And that ground of being, not so much intelligent design, but a mind, a knower, and then you get to the first knower, was there. How did that word play its way out in science? Or was it like Athena coming out of the head of Zeus, Mrs. Eddy the first one to really introduce it in the 19th century?
Yeah, let me free associate here a little bit. The notion that the universe is grounded by divine mind is a notion that is a very venerable notion in the history of philosophy and the history of science. In the 19th century, and I'd be interested in hearing David's comment on this, in the late 19th century, one thing that is often overlooked is, pragmatism gets an awful lot of attention because, as David pointed out, it is America's claim to philosophical originality. But in the late 19th century, philosophical idealism was the school of philosophy that probably could claim the largest number of distinguished philosophers. And of course, philosophical idealism is the affirmation that the universe is basically an artifact of mind. Scientists didn't tend to get involved in discussions like this, in large measure because, as a pure factual matter, the ultimate metaphysical principles underlying natural phenomena are not of great concern to scientists. They, in effect, say, we don't really care whether the real underlying substance behind matter is divine mind or not. We will treat matter as an end in itself. And our goal is to describe the operations of matter, whatever its ultimate ground of being might be.
It wasn't James's whole effort in psychology, found in the science of psychology, to understand the workings of, if not divine mind, the human mind?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And among philosophers and among religious thinkers, mind retained a privileged place within the scheme of reality. It's just that from a scientific point of view, it's, to paraphrase what Laplace allegedly at least said with regard to the hypothesis of God in creating the universe, I have no need of that hypothesis. Scientists don't need to adjudicate that particular question.
I'll add a little footnote to that. If you look at the history of philosophy of the United States, during the 19th century, idealism, which in one way or another said that mind is the ultimate reality, was the dominant mode. Up until about the Civil War, if you went to a college and you took the usual course, they were pretty lockstep. One of your senior courses was taught by the president of the college, and it usually was some version of philosophical idealism married to whatever was the religion of the school. And that was pretty common. During the whole 19th century, you would find all kinds of varieties of idealism. Matter of fact, here in Boston, you had at Boston University personalism. Nobody even talks about that version of idealism today. Most people don't even know it even existed. So that was the dominant note. But what I see happening is, particularly in Peirce and James, is they're going in a different direction. William James, in his latter work, is a pluralist. And he's saying the ultimate reality is whatever you happen to find it to be, and there are as many as people find. And some people find that very wishy-washy, but he was trying to be very open-minded. Charles Peirce is really very, very different, and not many people like to study this part of his philosophy because he was one who said that ultimately there is no matter, but all scientific phenomena is experienced. We can deal with it with the scientific methods, but his position was matter is effete mind, namely mind that is so worn out, it's fixed in its actions and reactions. And that's really a totally different way of going. So the American pragmatists were really breaking new ground in all kinds of ways. And they were opening up doors for different kinds of things. And that's what they were about.
It sounds like at the beginning of the 19th century, if I understand what you're saying correctly, that there was that sort of scientists, or what became to call it scientists, and theologians were kind of on the same track, and that at the end of the 19th century we end up what looks like more like what we have today as science. Where in that process did science become so materially based? At the beginning, there was a whole lot of different directions it seems that they could have gone, and in the end we get a very materialistic scientific view that discounts anything that we can't see, feel, or touch. How did that come about in that time?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with what kinds of instruments science had at its disposal. Science, in effect, said the only way that we can apprehend what's out there is through our senses and inferences based on what we learn from our senses. Now, obviously, they didn't necessarily take a commonsensical view of senses. Otherwise, as Mary Baker Eddy pointed out, when we say that the sun rises and sets, we'd be deceiving ourselves. We still use the phrase, but we know that the sun, in fact, does not rise and does not set. So I think, if you'll allow me to use the lowercase version of pragmatism, it was simply a decision based on what scientists had as instruments at their disposal, namely observation broadly construed to include scientific instruments, and that led them to sort of rely primarily on material processes as the objects of their inquiries. If I wasn't sufficiently clear in my presentation, let me be clear now. The overwhelming majority of scientists, even in the late 19th century, after they had established methodological naturalism as their norm, appear to have been theists. That is, they didn't deny that ultimately the universe was created and designed by God. But what really happened was that they determined that God was not useful as an explanatory device, that if they were going to make real progress in scientific analysis, they were going to have to limit what constituted a scientific explanation to natural processes. But that's not a statement about their religious beliefs.
I'd like to just add that if you accept this idea of the two great traditions, the Hellenistic and the European, as soon as the European tradition got started near the end of the Middle Ages, you're already on the track to an entirely secular science. It may take centuries before you discover that. But the people who founded that tradition were, for example, they said they were nominalists. That is, there are no Platonic ideas. And they were voluntarists. That is, God can do anything he wants. And if you start to look at that up against Christianity, you find out that religion just isn't going to survive on that basis. Now, it did take centuries for people to get to that point, but it was on that track right from the beginning.
I'd like to also just add to that in terms of John's mentioning the tools of investigation, at least in medical science, during the early part of the 19th century up until, say, 1870, you see very few tools for seeing inside the body. Elite physicians in America would go to Paris. They would go to the Paris clinics. They would have hundreds and hundreds of patients in these hospital clinics, and they would perform autopsies so that they could see, smell, touch. They could incise things. They could see the connection of lesions and maybe symptoms as this person died. But what happens in the latter part of the century is that we have new tools. We have better microscopes. Thermometers are used more frequently. The X-ray. So we can see more. Ooh, I touched my microphone. We can see more deeply into the body than ever before. We see the germs, we see the viruses, and that changes things. Now the physician is no longer sitting at the bedside of the patient doing this looking and listening and observing, but the work is being done in the laboratories, and we're extracting the knowledge from those places.
And another point, I think William James is a good example of a transitional figure, because if you look at his principles of psychology, he talks a lot about the brain, material organism. He talks about nerves. He had a laboratory where he was doing lots of experiments having to do with knowledge and how human minds functioned. But at the same time, he was really interested in spiritual matters, mental matters. He was one of the founders of the American Psychic Research Group in the United States, and he was kind of doing the two things. But what happened is that the kind of thinking he was doing on consciousness and on the psychic phenomena and on non-material things began to diminish because people were picking up the other side because you could work with it so well. You could use your procedures, you could justify what you were doing, and everything that's being said about additional instruments, new theories, new ways of calculating things. It just was something where people had all kinds of new opportunities, and they could have, we might say, or you might say, material success, and they went that way.
Yeah, if I could say one more thing that might tie a couple of the questions together. The one thing that we've ignored in this discussion that David just broached, there is one area of scientific inquiry in the late 19th century that really does prove corrosive to idealistic views of mind, and that's physiological psychology. Right. Increasingly, you have a school of thought emerge beginning with phrenology in the 1830s and 1840s and culminating in the rise of physiological psychology in the late 19th century that really does make a concerted effort to try to reduce consciousness and mind to the operations of matter and motion, namely brain functions.
I just had a question about homeopathy. I was interested in your, I hadn't realized before its linking with Swedenborgianism. And to what do you attribute the rise again of homeopathy and the interest of it in recent decades?
Oh, that's a very good question. I guess I would have to answer that in terms of recent decades. I see the rise of homeopathy in the late 1960s. And it really flowered after an article came out in Prevention magazine. Many of you may know of that magazine. It was devoted to organic gardening and farming and health. After that article came out, the existing organizations of lay people who had sort of kept homeopathy going through the early part of the 20th century began getting lots of inquiries and calls and people very interested in this new healing method, and then discovered it was an old healing method. And this corresponded with a real crisis in how do I want to put it, authority in mainstream medicine. People were becoming unhappy with mainstream medicine. Drugs, problems caused by drugs. Women were not being listened to in ways they wanted to be listened to by mostly male doctors. And at this point, you see the interest in homeopathy increase. It's very connected to the health food movement at that time, very connected to natural foods. A lot of the folks learned about homeopathy from these big natural foods conventions, health food conventions that are going on in the early 60s and 50s even. So it's at this time that you have a number of physicians who are actually in medical training at Harvard and other places who are not happy with what they're learning, with the approach to medicine, with the materialistic approach, and they finish their degrees and then take homeopathic training and become homeopathic physicians. So it grows from that period of time. And now you see homeopathic remedies in Walmart or CVS.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Oh, do we have another question? Or last question, right here, and then...
The frame of reference for my question is that my undergraduate work was as an engineer. And fundamental to engineering is a lot of math. As I moved up the program in taking math, including calculus and Fourier series, I had to understand each level before I could go to the next level. Now, using that as a frame of reference, in my understanding of what Mrs. Eddy was doing, she was doing the same thing. She experimented with this, she experimented with that, but she ended up in a position where she felt she had a principle that she could follow and she could demonstrate it. So my question to the panel is, because one of her conclusions was, as I understand it, the allness of the concept of good, which he would define as good or soul or spirit or mind or God, the definitions of God, the allness of that brought her to the conclusion of the nothingness of matter. And the panel has addressed this, awareness of matter and how it's thought about and how it's treated and how it's evolving in thought. But what is the panel's consideration of Mrs. Eddy's basic principle? There is no matter. the nothingness of matter. Is that an accepted principle? Is it rejected? Is it an antagonistic theory? Or is it something that is, one comment was, the scientific thought will evolve into the future? Is it something that maybe we might anticipate the world will sometime see?
It looks like we're ending on a very big question.
I think that what Mrs. Eddy came to when you said she came to a principle, she called it an apodictical principle. And that's a technical term in the Hellenistic tradition. It means a principle that you didn't get from the senses. It was revealed to you by intuition or some other means. It also means a demonstrable principle. So that's where the pragmatism, I think, with a small p comes in. That she felt that she had a principle that had been revealed to her and could be demonstrated. But that's all within that Hellenistic, that broad Hellenistic tradition. When you're talking about the sciences coming to the nothingness of matter, you're talking about sciences that are in the European tradition. They're starting with the allness of matter. They're not going to come to the nothingness from that beginning. Right. And I think that's the kind of metaphysical question that Jon said they're not even asking.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah, I remember in reading one of your books, Jon, and you can correct me if I got this wrong, but I think you said something to the fact that in the 19th century, science in a way went small.
Yep.
That it decided not to ask the big questions anymore, but to look at just immediate phenomena and derive patterns and assess patterns from that, and to really kind of depart from asking or attempting to address the big questions.
Yeah,
Can I add that that doesn't stop a few people with PhDs in physics and other fields from writing popular books and making a great deal out of money off of saying there is no matter. But that's quite apart from being a scientist.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and many thanks to our panel. It's really been fantastic having you here.